The Appalachian Mountains have always carried a certain mystery. They stretch across the eastern United States, filled with dense forests, winding trails, and small towns where stories seem to linger in the air. Locals will tell you the mountains hold more than just wildlife and history. They whisper about strange lights, chilling encounters, and things that don't quite fit the world we know. It's the kind of place where folklore and reality blur together. Ghost stories are passed down from generation to generation, each one darker than the last. But these aren't just legends. Many of these tales come from real people, sharing real experiences they claim happened deep in those hills. And that's what makes the Appalachian Mountains so haunting. It's not just the isolation. It's the feeling that something ancient is watching, just beyond the tree line. Hikers often report the sense of being followed, even when the trails are empty. Some say the silence itself feels heavy, as if the woods are holding their breath. At night, the mountains take on an entirely different character. The shadows grow longer, the air colder, and the forest seems alive in ways you can't explain. Stories range from ghostly apparitions in abandoned cabins to strange creatures spotted under the pale moonlight. Each one adds another layer to the Appalachian legend. Tonight, I'll share 8 of the most disturbing and scary true Appalachian horror stories. Whether you believe them or not, they're sure to send a chill down your spine. So settle in, turn down the lights, and let's start with the first story, about a lonely cabin deep in the woods, where a family discovered they weren't the only ones living there. A young couple once rented a small cabin deep in the Appalachian woods for what was supposed to be a quiet getaway. They wanted peace, no distractions, just fresh mountain air and each other. The cabin was rustic but cozy, tucked away at the end of a dirt road. Locals warned them about strange noises in the area, but they laughed it off as small-town superstition. The first night was peaceful enough. They built a fire, cooked dinner, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and wind moving through the trees. But around 3 a.m., the woman woke up suddenly. She swore she heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. Her partner got up, looked outside with a flashlight, but saw nothing. No tracks, no movement. Just still woods and the sound of his own breathing. The next morning, they brushed it off as nerves. Maybe an animal had wandered close. After all, bears and deer were common in the region. But when they stepped outside, they noticed something unsettling. Footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not shoes, but bare human feet. The prints were large, spaced far apart, and circled the cabin before vanishing into the tree line. They didn't remember hearing anyone leave. That night, they locked the doors and windows tight. But again, just past midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, the sound stopped directly under their bedroom window. They didn't dare look. Instead, they whispered prayers until the sound eventually faded away into the woods. By the third night, they were too nervous to sleep. Every creak of the cabin felt like it could be someone, or something, outside. At around 2 a.m., they heard scratching on the wooden walls. Not claws, fingernails dragging slowly as if someone wanted them to know they weren't alone. Terrified, the man finally shouted, "Get out of here!" But the scratching only paused for a moment, then continued with more pressure. When he swung open the door with a lantern, the woods looked empty. But the bare footprints were back, fresh in the dirt, leading toward the trees. The couple considered leaving immediately, but it was the middle of the night and the mountain road was dangerous in the dark. So they stayed, huddled together, jumping at every sound. The scratching stopped, but the uneasy silence felt even worse. When daylight finally came, they walked around the cabin and found something new. Handprints, smeared in mud, pressed against the windows. Every window had them, as if someone had slowly circled the cabin, peering inside. The prints were high, some nearly at the roofline, far taller than any normal person could reach. That was enough. They packed their bags and drove down the mountain, not caring if they lost their rental deposit. Later, when they mentioned it to locals, an old man simply nodded. He said people in those woods often saw the Watchers. He didn't elaborate, and they didn't ask. To this day, the couple refuses to return to the Appalachians. They both agree. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a prank. Something else was out there. Some believe it could have been wild men, people who've abandoned society and live feral in the mountains. Others whisper it was something older, something not quite human. Whatever it was, the couple says they'll never forget the sound of those fingernails dragging along the cabin walls in the dead of night. And honestly, when I think about that story, I can't help but imagine how helpless it must have felt, trapped, deep in the woods, with something circling you. It makes you wonder if some places are better left untouched, no matter how peaceful they might look in daylight. Because in the Appalachian Mountains, beauty and terror sometimes live side by side. And once the sun goes down, you never really know what's out there in the darkness. That was just the first story. Creepy enough, right? But the next one takes us from cabins into the world of hikers, people who thought they were safe on marked trails. And as you'll see, sometimes the path itself isn't the danger, it's what's watching you from the woods around it. So let's move on to story number 2. Two college friends decided to go backpacking through the Appalachian Trail one summer. They were both experienced hikers, confident and eager to explore the wild beauty of the mountains. The first few days went smoothly. Long hikes, campfires at night, and star-filled skies. But by the fourth day, they noticed something odd. Every time they stopped to rest, they heard twigs snapping behind them. When they turned around, the trail looked empty. At first, they assumed it was a deer or maybe another hiker lagging behind, but as the hours passed, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. One of them joked nervously, "Maybe we've got a stalker ghost," trying to laugh it off, but the other admitted he felt the same, like unseen eyes were locked on them. That night, they set up camp in a clearing. As they settled in, they heard slow footsteps in the distance. Not animals scurrying, human footsteps, deliberate and heavy. They grabbed their flashlights and scanned the trees, but nothing reflected back. Just the quiet woods and the sound of crickets. Then came the whistling, a low, tuneless whistle drifting through the forest, too faint to place, but close enough to send chills down their spines. One of them shouted, "Who's there?" But there was no answer. The whistling stopped, replaced by silence so thick it felt unnatural. They stayed awake most of the night, clutching their knives and flashlights, listening for movement. Nothing happened until just before dawn. As the first light crept in, they found footprints near their camp. Human footprints, large and leading in a circle around their tents. Worse yet, the prints showed someone had stopped just inches from their campfire, standing there in the dark, watching them sleep. The two packed up quickly, too shaken to eat breakfast. They decided to hike faster, hoping to lose whoever or whatever was following them. But by midday, the footsteps returned. This time, they were clearer, matching their pace exactly. Stop, and the footsteps stopped. Move, and they moved. One of the friends suggested leaving the trail to cut through the forest, but the other argued that was even more dangerous. The path, at least, was known. That night, they camped in silence, not daring to light a fire. They hoped darkness would hide them. But once again, the whistling began. This time, it was closer, drifting just beyond the tree line. The sound rose and fell, like someone enjoying a private tune. Suddenly, a rock landed near their tent. Then another. Whoever it was, they weren't just watching anymore. They were playing games. Terrified, they packed their gear in the dark and started hiking with headlamps, breaking every safety rule they knew just to get out of there. For hours, the sound of someone moving just out of sight followed them. A branch snapped here, a crunch of leaves there. Always close, never seen. By sunrise, they stumbled into a ranger station, exhausted and pale. They told the ranger everything. The ranger listened quietly, then asked where exactly they had camped. When they described it, the ranger's expression darkened. He told them that area had long been avoided by locals. Hikers had reported the same whistling, the same footsteps, for years. Some believed it was just an unhinged drifter living off the land. Others whispered about something older, an Appalachian legend about shadowy watchers in the forest. The ranger didn't say which he believed, but he warned them never to camp there again. The two friends cut their trip short and left the mountains that same day. To this day, they refused to return to the Appalachians. What unsettled them most wasn't just the whistling or the rocks. It was the certainty that whoever followed them could have stepped closer but never did, almost like they were being toyed with. When I think about that story, I always wonder, what would have happened if they hadn't left their tent that night? Would they have just woken up to more footprints or something worse? And honestly, that's the scariest part of these tales. Sometimes the unknown is more terrifying than anything you can see. That was the second story. Creepy enough, right? But the next one doesn't take place on a trail. It takes place in a small mountain town where locals know not to go out after dark. Because sometimes in the Appalachians, the danger doesn't come from the woods. It comes from the people who live in their shadows. And that's exactly what we'll see in story number 3. There's a story about a pair of travelers who stopped in a tiny Appalachian town late one evening. They'd been driving for hours, looking for a place to eat and rest before continuing their trip. The town seemed quiet. Too quiet. A single gas station, a diner, and a few houses. No cars on the road, no kids playing, just empty streets bathed in dim orange light. They pulled into the diner, relieved to see the open sign glowing in the window. But when they stepped inside, the chatter stopped. Every head turned. Locals stared, their faces unreadable. Nobody smiled, nobody spoke. It was as if two outsiders had walked into a room where they didn't belong. The couple sat at a booth, trying to ignore the stares. A waitress finally came over, her voice flat as she asked, "You folks just passing through?" Something in her tone felt more like a warning than a question. The couple nodded quickly, saying they'd be gone by morning. Their food came, but they barely touched it. Every time they looked up, someone was watching them. It wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion. One man at the counter muttered, "Shouldn't have stopped here." Another replied, "They'll figure it out." The couple pretended not to hear. When they paid and left, the atmosphere outside felt even heavier. A group of men leaned against a truck, silently following the couple with their eyes. As they drove out of town, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. A truck tailed them closely, its high beams blinding in the night. For miles, the truck stayed on their bumper, weaving side to side like it was hurting them along the road. The couple panicked. Every turn they made, the truck followed. Finally, after nearly an hour, the truck suddenly slowed and turned off onto another road. They didn't stop driving until they were miles away. Only then did they dare to pull over and catch their breath. Later, they told their story to friends, who laughed and said they'd just run into unfriendly locals. But the couple didn't see it that way. They swore it felt coordinated, as if the entire town had been waiting for them, watching their every move. Some believe they stumbled into an insular community that didn't welcome outsiders. Others whispered darker theories about towns where secrets are guarded with silence. What unsettled the couple most wasn't the stairs or even the truck. It was the way the waitress had said, "Just passing through," almost as if she was relieved when they promised to leave. When I think about this story, it always gives me chills. Because sometimes the scariest part of the Appalachians isn't the wilderness. It's the people living in the shadows of those mountains. Not all towns are like that, of course, but once in a while you come across a place where you feel, deep down, you don't belong. And the smartest thing you can do is keep driving. That was the third story. Creepy, right? Now, let's move on to story 4. This one takes us back into the woods, where a group of campers learned that strange noises in the night aren't always harmless. Because in the Appalachians, silence isn't always safety. Sometimes silence means something is listening. And when it decides to show itself, it might be too late. A group of 4 friends decided to camp deep in the Appalachian woods. They'd hiked all day and found the perfect clearing near a creek, remote, quiet, and far from anyone else. They set up their tents, built a fire, and spent the evening laughing under the stars. For a while, it felt like the perfect camping trip, but around midnight, one of them froze mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The others fell silent. From beyond the tree line came a faint sound, like singing, soft, low, almost like a lullaby drifting through the woods. They looked at each other confused. Who would be out here singing in the middle of the night? One of them joked nervously, "Maybe it's another group of campers." But the nearest trail was miles away. The singing grew louder, shifting into a strange humming. It circled their camp, moving from one side of the clearing to the other. They grabbed flashlights and shone them toward the trees, but the beams caught only branches swaying in the wind. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Uneasy, they doused the fire and retreated into their tents, hoping it would pass. But sleep didn't come. Around 2 a.m., they heard footsteps, slow, heavy, crunching through the leaves just outside their tents. One of them whispered, "It's circling us." The sound moved around the camp, pausing at each tent before continuing. Finally, something brushed against the fabric of one tent, dragging slowly across the side. The camper inside clamped a hand over his mouth to keep from screaming. The footsteps retreated, fading into the woods. For a few minutes, the only sound was their pounding hearts. Then, from deep in the forest, the singing returned, louder this time, more voices joining in, almost like a chorus. It wasn't cheerful singing. It was slow, mournful, like a funeral hymn carried on the wind. Terrified, they packed what little they could carry, abandoning their camp and sprinting down the dark trail with only headlamps to guide them. The singing followed, echoing from the trees, as if whoever, or whatever it was, didn't want them to leave. Only when the first light of dawn appeared did the sounds finally stop. Exhausted, they collapsed near the roadside, shaken but alive. When they returned later with rangers to collect the rest of their gear, they found something chilling. Around the fire pit were small handprints pressed into the dirt. Dozens of them. Too small for adults, but far too numerous to be explained by chance. The rangers shrugged it off, saying it was probably kids from a nearby town. But the friends swore there hadn't been any children out there. Even now, they don't know if it was people playing tricks or something older and stranger that lives in the Appalachians. Whatever it was, they all agree. The singing was the most haunting sound they'd ever heard, and they've never camped in the mountains since. When I think about this story, it always sticks with me, because in the wilderness you expect animals, storms, maybe even other hikers. But you don't expect voices in the night, circling your camp like they're performing a ritual. It makes you wonder what kind of history lingers in those woods, and whether some voices never stopped singing. That was story number 4. And if that one made you uneasy, the next one might hit even harder. Because sometimes, the scariest part of the Appalachians isn't what you hear, it's what you see staring back at you. Let's move into story 5. A solo hiker named Daniel set out for a 3-day trek through a remote stretch of the Appalachian Mountains. He was experienced, confident, and loved the solitude of the wilderness. On his second evening, he stopped near a ridge to set up camp. The view was stunning. The valley stretched for miles, glowing orange under the setting sun. As night fell, Daniel sat by his fire, eating a simple meal. That's when he noticed movement in the tree line about 50 yards away. At first, he assumed it was a deer, but when he looked closer, he realized it was a person. Tall, thin, standing completely still between the trees. Daniel called out, asking if they were lost or needed help. No answer. The figure didn't move. After a few moments, Daniel tried to convince himself it was just another camper. He finished eating and went into his tent, though unease gnawed at him. Around midnight, he woke up to the sound of footsteps circling his camp. Slow, deliberate steps crunching leaves just outside. He unzipped his tent slightly and shone his flashlight. The beam caught nothing, just empty trees. But the footsteps continued, just beyond the edge of light. Suddenly, silence. Then, from the ridge he heard laughter. low, drawn out, echoing through the valley. Daniel froze. The sound wasn't close, but it carried in a way that made his skin crawl. He stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching a knife, listening for movement. But the footsteps didn't return. At dawn, he stepped outside and scanned the ridge. There, in the tree line, stood the same figure from the night before, still watching, unmoving. Daniel shouted, demanding to know who they were. Again, no reply. The figure simply turned and walked back into the forest. Shaken, Daniel packed up quickly. He considered cutting his trip short, but stubbornness pushed him to continue. That night, he set camp farther along the trail. For a while, everything seemed fine, until he looked up from his fire. The figure was back. Same distance, same stillness, standing just beyond the tree line. This time, Daniel didn't call out. He doused his fire and stayed inside his tent, barely breathing. Hours later, he woke again to soft whistling. The same off-key tune repeating over and over, moving slowly around his camp. It stopped only when the first light of dawn touched the trees. Exhausted, Daniel abandoned the rest of his hike and headed back to civilization. When he told rangers what happened, they said no one else had signed into that stretch of the trail. He should have been completely alone. Daniel doesn't know if it was a drifter, a hermit, or something else entirely, but he swears the figure's presence didn't feel human. He describes it as empty, almost hollow, like a shadow that had learned to stand upright, and the whistling still haunts him in his sleep. When I hear that story, it gets under my skin, because in the wilderness you expect animals. You don't expect someone to follow you night after night, never speaking, never approaching. It's as if the mountains themselves had sent something to remind Daniel that he wasn't welcome. That was story 5. Creepy enough already, but the next one is darker still, because while hikers and campers sometimes escape, not everyone is that lucky. Story 6 is about a disappearance, one that still leaves people asking questions, and it might make you think twice before wandering too far off the beaten path. A man named Robert loved hiking the Appalachians. He was familiar with the trails and often went alone, bringing only a backpack, a map, and his camera. In the fall of one year, he set out on a weekend trip. He told friends he'd be back Sunday evening, but Sunday came and went, and Robert never returned. When he didn't show up for work Monday, a search party was launched. Dozens of volunteers scoured the trail he'd marked on his map. At first, they found normal signs, boot prints, candy wrappers, and even a campsite that looked like it had been used. But then, the trail ended abruptly. His footprints stopped in the middle of a stretch of dirt path. No sign of him moving forward or turning back. Search dogs picked up his scent, but it led them in circles, never beyond a half-mile radius. Rescuers found his camera in a patch of grass. The last photos were normal: trees, a creek, a selfie. Then, the final image showed something strange. It was blurry, taken at night, but in the corner of the frame was what looked like a tall, pale figure standing among the trees. The photo rattled everyone who saw it. Some said it was just a trick of the light. Others swore they saw a face, long, hollow, with black eyes. Robert himself was never found. No body, no belongings, no clear trace of where he went. It was as if the forest swallowed him whole. Locals whispered about the lost ones, spirits that lure hikers away from the trail, never to be seen again. Others believed Robert stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, maybe an old hideout or even a hidden community deep in the mountains. But his friends reject those explanations. They believe the photo says it all. Robert encountered something out there, and it took him. For years after, hikers reported eerie feelings in the same stretch of woods. Some claimed to see movement in their peripheral vision, always just out of focus. One even reported hearing his name whispered in the wind, though Robert had never told anyone he planned to hike that trail. Searchers eventually gave up. The official record lists him as missing, presumed dead. But in the mountains, stories like his are never truly closed. To this day, some hikers leave small markers along that trail, stones stacked in piles or ribbons tied to branches as a kind of offering, almost as if they're hoping to keep whatever took Robert satisfied so it doesn't follow them. When I think about his story, it feels like one of those unsolved mysteries that burrow into your mind, because disappearance without a trace is scarier than any monster. That was story 6. Now, as terrifying as vanishing without explanation is, the next tale is just as chilling, because sometimes the fear isn't being taken. It's realizing someone or something was in your home, watching, without you even knowing. Let's move on to story 7. In one small Appalachian town, a young woman moved into a rental house tucked against the woods. It was old, but cheap, and she liked the quiet. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. She enjoyed her new space, though she often felt uneasy at night. Strange noises kept her awake. Creaks above the ceiling, footsteps in the attic. She brushed it off as the house settling, but the noises became more distinct. She swore she heard dragging sounds like furniture being moved across the floorboards overhead. One evening, she noticed food missing from her kitchen. At first, she thought she had forgotten she ate it, but then whole containers vanished. She started locking her doors more carefully, though the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. A neighbor mentioned casually, "That house has a history." But when she pressed for details, the neighbor just shook their head and changed the subject. Finally, unable to ignore the sounds, she called a friend to help her check the attic. They climbed the ladder, flashlights in hand, and what they found made their blood run cold. In the corner of the dusty attic was a small nest. Blankets, food wrappers, even a notebook. Someone had been living there. The woman nearly fainted. She had been sleeping in that house for weeks, unaware a stranger was just a few feet above her. The police were called. They searched the attic but found no one. Whoever had been there was gone. But the notebook left behind was disturbing. Inside were pages of scribbles, her name, her routines, and notes about what she wore each day. One entry read, "She goes to bed at 11. She doesn't check the locks." Another, "She hums when she cooks. It's nice." The realization hit her hard. Someone had been watching her every move, living in her attic, and coming down whenever she was gone or asleep. The police never found the intruder. Neighbors claimed no one suspicious had been seen nearby. The woman moved out immediately, abandoning most of her belongings. She never set foot in that house again. Locals later whispered it wasn't the first time that had happened in the area. A few other old homes had similar reports: unexplained noises, food going missing, strangers vanishing before police arrived. Some called them squatters. Others believed it was something far stranger: mountain people who slipped into towns, hiding in attics and basements, watching. To this day, she says the scariest part isn't that someone lived above her, it's that they wrote about her, as if they knew her better than she knew herself. That was story 7. And as horrifying as it is to think of someone living above you, the final story might be even darker. Because sometimes, in the Appalachians, you're not just being watched, you're being hunted. A pair of brothers loved hunting in the Appalachian foothills. Every fall, they set out for a week-long trip, pitching camp deep in the forest. One year, they noticed something unusual. Deer were scarce, birds fell silent, and even the usual rustle of squirrels was absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The brothers laughed it off at first, but unease began creeping in. That night, as they sat by the fire, they heard a strange howl echoing through the trees. It wasn't a coyote or wolf. It was deeper, slower, almost human. They listened in silence until the sound faded. Then, just as they were about to relax, it came again, closer this time. They grabbed their rifles and scanned the tree line, but nothing moved. Only the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. Deciding to turn in, they left the fire burning low and tried to sleep. Around midnight, one of them woke to the sound of twigs snapping nearby. Peeking outside the tent, he saw a tall figure standing just at the edge of the firelight. At first, he thought it was a man, But as his eyes adjusted, he realized the figure's proportions were off. Too tall, arms too long, head tilted unnaturally. When he blinked, it was gone. Just vanished into the dark. The next morning, they found massive footprints near their camp. Barefoot, but wider and longer than any human should have. Shaken, they debated leaving. But stubbornness and pride kept them in the woods. That night, the howling returned. This time it circled their camp, moving faster, louder, like whatever it was enjoyed their fear. One of the brothers fired his rifle into the trees. Silence followed. Then came a sound that chilled them to the bone. Laughter. Not human laughter exactly, but something trying to mimic it. They barely slept. When dawn came, they packed up and started hiking out. But it was clear they weren't alone. Branches snapped behind them. Rocks tumbled down slopes as if knocked loose by heavy steps. Every time they stopped, the forest went quiet. Move again, and the noises returned. By the third day, exhaustion and fear had set in. The brothers barely spoke, too focused on reaching safety. Late that afternoon, as they neared the edge of the forest, they heard it one last time. The howl. Louder, closer, echoing so hard it rattled their chests. They ran, stumbling through brush until they burst into a clearing where their truck was parked. Only then did the sound stop. The woods fell completely silent, as if nothing had happened. The brothers swore they never looked back. They drove away without speaking, not daring to check if something followed. Years later, when telling the story, they both agreed on one thing. Whatever was in those woods wasn't an animal. It was intelligent. It hunted them, and it wanted them to know it. Some say they encountered a legendary creature of the Appalachians, something older than folklore, a predator that plays with its prey before striking. Others say it was just exhaustion and paranoia. But the brothers never hunted in those mountains again, and even when they tell the story today, their voices shake, like they're right back in those dark woods. That was the 8th and final story. And honestly, out of all these Appalachian tales, this one makes me wonder, what exactly is hiding in those forests? And there you have it, 8 disturbing and scary true horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. Each one different, yet all carrying the same theme. The mountains hold secrets, from strange watchers in the woods, to eerie singing in the night, to towns that seem hostile toward strangers. Appalachia is filled with mysteries that defy explanation. Some of these tales might be folklore mixed with imagination. Others come straight from real people who swear what they saw was true. But that's the power of the Appalachian Mountains. They're beautiful, haunting, and endlessly fascinating. These stories remind us that even in the modern world, there are still places that feel untouched, where the unknown still thrives. And sometimes, the scariest part isn't the monsters we imagine. It's the possibility that something very real is hiding just out of sight. Whether it's the silent footsteps around a cabin or a figure standing too long at the tree line, each encounter leaves a lasting chill. And the people who experience them never seem to forget. I don't know about you, but after hearing these stories, the thought of camping alone in the Appalachians sounds a lot less appealing, because what if the next story ends up being yours? When I think about these mountains, I picture beauty by day, and something entirely different by night. The quiet forests, the endless trails, and the shadows that never quite seem empty. It makes me wonder, how many other stories are out there that we'll never hear, because the people who lived them didn't make it back? And maybe that's why locals are so protective of their legends. They know better than anyone that some of these warnings exist for a reason. Next time you hear a whistle in the woods, or footsteps that stop when you stop, remember these stories. Maybe it's just your imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the mountains watching you. That's what makes Appalachia so haunting. Beauty and terror, side by side, waiting for those who dare to explore. But tell me, which of these 8 stories creeped you out the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think they're just folklore? Or could there really be something out there in the Appalachian dark? Either way, these stories have stood the test of time, passed down, retold, and still giving people chills. And maybe that's the scariest part. They keep happening, because the Appalachian Mountains aren't finished telling their secrets. And who knows? The next traveler or hiker might stumble into another story that adds to the legend. But for now, I think we've had enough chills for one night. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most mysterious regions in America. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe for more creepy true stories every week. Don't forget to turn on the bell icon so you never miss an upload, because trust me, we've got plenty more chilling stories waiting to be told. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the scariest stories aren't urban legends at all. They're true. That's it for tonight. Stay safe, stay curious, and maybe avoid hiking alone in the Appalachians. Because as we've learned tonight, you never really know what's out there. And if you ever find yourself deep in those mountains, listen closely to the silence. If it feels heavy, if it feels wrong, you might not be as alone as you think. Trust your instincts, because in a place like that, ignoring them could be dangerous. The forest is beautiful, but beauty can be deceiving. And the shadows there have been keeping secrets for centuries. Secrets that don't always want to stay hidden. So, as you turn off this video tonight, just remember, the mountains are still out there, waiting, watching. And sometimes they watch a little too closely. Good night.